They destroyed a veteran's government check right in front of him, calling him a fraud. But when federal agents walked through those bank doors 30 seconds later, they weren't there to arrest the veteran. The morning fog hung thick over downtown Seattle as Caleb Robinson stood across the street from the gleaming glass tower that bore his name, Robinson Financial Group. 15 floors of marble and mahogany, home to one of the nation's most successful regional banking empires. But today, Caleb wasn't heading to the penthouse office where billion-dollar decisions were made. Today, he was going to the ground floor branch, dressed in a faded Army surplus jacket that had seen better decades, worn combat boots that told stories of a different life, and carrying a government check that would test everything he thought he knew about his own company. The transformation had taken months to plan. 3 years ago, Caleb's younger brother, Marcus, had come home from his second tour in Afghanistan, broken and struggling. When Marcus tried to cash his disability check at a Robinson branch, he'd been treated like a criminal, questioned, humiliated, and ultimately turned away. Marcus never got the chance to tell Caleb what happened. He took his own life 2 weeks later. Caleb found the incident report buried in customer complaints, filed away and forgotten. That's when he realized the empire he'd built on the promise of serving every customer had failed the person who mattered most to him. The guilt had eaten at him ever since, driving him to this moment. He adjusted the worn baseball cap lower over his face and crossed the street. Inside his jacket pocket, his fingers found the treasury check, made out to Marcus Robinson, a name he'd legally added to his own months ago. The check was real, issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs for disability compensation. Everything about this test would be authentic, except for one thing: the man presenting it. The branch buzzed with the typical Tuesday morning energy. Customers in business suits moved efficiently through the marble lobby, while others waited in leather chairs, scrolling through phones. Behind the polished counter, 4 tellers worked with practiced precision, their movements sharp and professional. But as Caleb approached, something shifted in the atmosphere. Conversations quieted. Eyes followed his weathered appearance, taking in the faded jacket, the unkempt beard he'd grown for this moment, and the slight limp he'd adopted to complete the disguise. He chose the line for Jennifer Walsh, a teller he'd never met, but whose performance reviews he'd read. Top marks for efficiency, consistent numbers, no mention of how she treated customers who didn't fit the branch's typical demographic. When his turn came, Caleb stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. For 3 years, he'd wondered what Marcus had experienced in these final moments before giving up on a system that was supposed to support him. "Next," Jennifer called, not looking up from her computer screen. Caleb approached the window, pulling the check from his jacket pocket with hands that trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of what this moment represented. "I'd like to cash this, please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jennifer glanced up, and Caleb saw her expression change instantly. Her professional smile faltered as she took in his appearance, her eyes narrowing with immediate suspicion. "ID," she said curtly, no longer making eye contact. Caleb slid his identification under the bulletproof glass, a perfect replica bearing Marcus Robinson's name, with veteran designation. He'd spared no expense ensuring every detail was flawless. Jennifer examined the ID with exaggerated scrutiny, holding it up to the light, checking the hologram, running her fingers over the surface. Her movements were theatrical, designed to draw attention from other customers and staff. "This check," she said, picking it up between 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. "Where did you get this?" "It's mine," Caleb replied, staying in character. "Veterans Affairs Disability Compensation." Jennifer's laugh was cold and sharp. "Right, and I'm supposed to believe that?" Around them, other customers had begun to notice the interaction. Some craned their necks to get a better view, while others pulled out phones, sensing drama brewing. "Ma'am, I just need to cash my check," Caleb said, his voice carrying the exhausted patience of someone who'd fought this battle before. "The paper stock is wrong," Jennifer announced loudly, holding the check up for others to see. "The routing numbers don't match our system. And frankly, sir, you don't look like someone who'd be receiving this kind of payment." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. This was exactly what Marcus had faced. The assumption that appearance determined worthiness. The public humiliation designed to make him leave quietly. But this time, there would be consequences. "I can call for verification," Caleb offered, pulling out a phone with a number that would connect directly to the VA's authentication line. "That won't be necessary," Jennifer said, her voice growing louder, more confident. She was performing now, showing the growing crowd how she protected the bank from fraud. Without warning, without following protocol, without giving Caleb a chance to respond, Jennifer fed the check into the shredder beside her station. The machine's mechanical whir filled the sudden silence. Caleb watched, frozen, as the check disappeared into metal teeth, torn apart and destroyed in seconds. "Security," Jennifer called, pressing a button under her counter. "We have a fraud attempt at window 3. But instead of despair, instead of the broken defeat that had consumed Marcus, Caleb felt something else entirely, a cold, focused rage that had been building for 3 years. He stepped back from the window, pulling out his phone with steady hands. The crowd around him murmured, some recording, others simply staring at the scene unfolding before them. "That's it. They destroyed his check," someone whispered. "Poor guy. He really needed that money." Caleb ignored them all, focusing on the single contact in his phone labeled Federal Response Team, a number he'd hoped never to use, connected to agents who'd been standing by for this exact moment. "It's done," he said simply into the phone. "They destroyed it." "Copy that, sir. We're moving in." Jennifer was still explaining to the branch manager, David Chen, how she had identified the obvious fraud when the first black sedan pulled up outside, then another, and another. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, customers watched as men and women in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, their movements precise and purposeful. The branch doors opened with a sharp chime, and Special Agent Sarah Martinez led a team of 6 federal investigators into the lobby. Their badges were already visible, and the atmosphere shifted instantly from curious murmuring to dead silence. "Nobody move," Agent Martinez announced, her voice carrying absolute authority. "This is a federal investigation. Everyone remain calm and stay where you are." Jennifer's face drained of color as the agents approached her station. David Chen stepped forward, trying to regain control of his branch. "Officers, I'm the branch manager. What is the meaning of this?" "Agent Martinez, FBI Financial Crimes Division," she replied with her credentials. "We're investigating the unlawful destruction of a United States Treasury instrument, specifically a Veterans Affairs Disability Compensation check." She gestured toward Caleb, who remained standing calmly near the shredder, his phone still in his hand. "That man attempted to defraud our bank," Jennifer said quickly, pointing at Caleb. "I followed protocol exactly. The check was obviously fake." Agent Martinez walked to the shredder, examining the metal housing that had consumed the check minutes earlier. "Ma'am, you destroyed a legitimate treasury check without following federal verification protocols. That's a felony under Title 18 of the United States Code." But it couldn't be real," Jennifer stammered. "Look at him. He's clearly homeless, probably mentally ill. Veterans don't look like that." The words hung in the air like poison. Around the lobby, customers shifted uncomfortably, some recording the exchange on their phones. The casual prejudice, the cruel assumptions, all captured for the world to see. Agent Martinez pulled out a tablet, swiping to a screen filled with official documentation. Mr. Marcus Robinson is a disabled veteran with full eligibility for VA compensation. The check you destroyed was issued legally and was completely authentic. She turned to face Jennifer directly. Your failure to follow verification protocols, combined with the destruction of federal property based on discriminatory assumptions, constitutes multiple federal violations. David Chen stepped forward, sweat visible on his forehead. Agents, I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding. Our teller was following bank policy. Your bank policy, Agent Martinez interrupted, is superseded by federal law when handling Treasury instruments. Your employees' actions were illegal, regardless of internal procedures. While this drama...
The individual who was just discriminated against, whose legal check was destroyed without cause, is not just a disabled veteran, Agent Martinez announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the marble space. He is Caleb Marcus Robinson, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Robinson Financial Group, the parent company of this bank. The silence that followed was absolute. Jennifer's mouth fell open. David Chen's face went white. Customers began whispering urgently, some snapping photos, others simply staring in disbelief. Caleb slowly removed his baseball cap, revealing the face that graced the annual reports, the business magazines, the financial news shows. Without the cap and unkempt beard, his identity was unmistakable. This was a compliance test, Agent Martinez continued. Mr. Robinson has been investigating reports of discriminatory practices at his own branches, particularly toward veterans and other vulnerable populations. Jennifer sank into her chair, the weight of what she'd done crushing down on her. She'd not only violated federal law and destroyed a veteran's check, she'd humiliated and insulted her own company's CEO. "I didn't know," she whispered, but the words rang hollow in the vast lobby. Caleb finally spoke, his voice carrying 3 years of grief and rage and determination. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know," he said, walking slowly toward Jennifer's window. "You saw someone who didn't fit your idea of what a veteran should look like, and you decided he was beneath your respect." He placed both hands on the counter, leaning forward so she had to meet his eyes. 3 years ago, my brother Marcus, a real disabled veteran, was treated exactly like this at one of my branches. He was questioned, humiliated, and turned away. 2 weeks later, he took his own life. Jennifer's sob was audible throughout the lobby. Around them, customers and staff absorbed the full weight of the moment. "This test wasn't about me," Caleb continued. "It was about every veteran who walks into a bank carrying the invisible wounds of service, who gets judged by their appearance instead of their sacrifice." He straightened up, his voice growing stronger, more commanding, the voice of a CEO addressing his employees. "Ms. Walsh, you're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Mr. Chen, you're suspended pending a full investigation of branch procedures and training protocols." Agent Martinez stepped forward again. "Mr. Robinson, there are still federal charges to consider. The destruction of a Treasury check is a serious offense, regardless of the circumstances." "I understand, and I won't interfere with federal prosecution. Some lessons can only be learned through consequences." Outside, the first news van was pulling up to the curb. Soon the story would be everywhere. The billionaire CEO who disguised himself as a homeless veteran to expose discrimination in his own company. But for Caleb, the real story was simpler and more personal. It was about a promise he'd made, standing at his brother's grave, about ensuring no other veteran would face what Marcus had endured. As federal agents began interviewing witnesses and documenting evidence, As fired employees were escorted out and reporters gathered outside, Caleb walked to a quiet corner of the lobby and pulled out his phone one more time. This call wasn't to federal agents or news outlets. It was to Dr. Patricia Williams, director of the Seattle Veterans Center. Dr. Williams, it's Caleb Robinson. The operation was successful. I'm ready to move forward with our discussion about establishing veteran-only banking services at every Robinson branch. He paused, listening to her response, watching through the windows as more news crews arrived. "No, this isn't about public relations," he said quietly. "This is about making sure my brother's death meant something." When he ended the call, Agent Martinez approached him one final time. "Mr. Robinson, what you did today took considerable courage and considerable resources. Why put yourself through this? Why not just change policies from the executive level?" Caleb looked around the lobby, at the shredder that had destroyed his check, at the faces of customers who were still processing what they'd witnessed. Because sometimes you have to walk in someone else's boots to understand the journey. And sometimes the most powerful person in the room needs to be the most vulnerable, if only for a moment. As the federal investigation continued and the media circus grew outside, Caleb made his way toward the exit. He had a company to rebuild, policies to rewrite, and a culture to change. But first, he had a grave to visit and a promise to keep. The story that would dominate headlines for weeks was about corporate accountability, federal investigations, and social justice. But for one man in a faded army jacket, it was about something much simpler, about honoring the memory of a brother who'd served his country only to be failed by the system he'd fought to protect. In the days that followed, the video footage of Jennifer Walsh destroying the check and making discriminatory comments would go viral, viewed millions of times across social media platforms. The Robinson Financial Group would face federal scrutiny, public relations challenges, and a complete overhaul of their customer service training. Jennifer Walsh would be charged with destruction of federal property and face prison time. David Chen would be terminated and blacklisted from the banking industry. The branch would be closed for 2 weeks while investigators combed through years of customer complaints and discriminatory practices. But the most significant change came quietly in boardrooms and policy documents that the public would never see. Every Robinson Financial Group location would now have a Veterans Services Specialist. Every employee would undergo mandatory training on serving vulnerable populations. And a substantial portion of the company's profits would be redirected to veteran support services. Caleb Robinson had walked into his own bank as a homeless-looking veteran and walked out as a man with a mission. The check might have been shredded, but the message it carried would reshape an entire industry's approach to serving those who'd served their country. The federal agents finished their investigation, the news crews eventually moved on to other stories, and life returned to normal for most people who'd witnessed the events that day. But in boardrooms across the country, executives were asking themselves a troubling question. If the CEO of a major corporation could disguise himself to test their commitment to treating all customers with dignity, who else might be watching? And in VA offices and veteran support groups across the nation, the story took on a different meaning entirely. It became proof that someone with power was willing to use it not for personal gain, but to ensure that those who'd sacrificed for their country would never again face discrimination simply for seeking what they'd rightfully earned. The shredded check had been destroyed, but the trust it helped rebuild would last for generations. Some stories end with justice served and wrongs made right. Others end with powerful lessons learned and systems permanently changed. This story ended with both, and with a simple truth that resonated far beyond the marble walls of one downtown bank. Sometimes, the most important battles are fought not with weapons or words, but with the courage to see the world through someone else's eyes. Would you have the courage to walk in those worn combat boots? Would you risk everything to expose the truth about how our most vulnerable citizens are treated when they think no one important is watching? Don't share this story unless you're ready to face what you might find in your own workplace, your own community, your own heart. Because sometimes the person who needs our compassion most is standing right in front of us, and we're too blinded by assumptions to see them clearly. The check was shredded, but the courage it took to cash it changed everything.